Christmas dinner, Aunt Dilly asked, "Is Pia keeping up with her friends since the kidney transplant?" I froze mid-bite. What transplant? Pia's still on the waiting list. My parents' faces drained of color. But your parents told me she got one years ago. Said everything went perfectly. Dilly, you must be confused, I said softly, reaching across to touch her hand. She's been on the waiting list for almost 3 years now. Dilly yanked her phone from her purse, scrolling frantically through old email chains. No. Your parents told me that you got lucky with a transplant almost straight away. See? She scrolled through dozens of emails from my parents, all detailing Pia's miraculous recovery. Look at this one from last year. Pia's doing wonderfully, back to being a normal kid. And here, she just started dance class again. Her hands trembled as she scrolled further. They sent me pictures of her at a birthday party, said she was thriving. My heart pounded. Pia hadn't been to a birthday party in 3 years. She'd never taken dance. And here, they said you turned down my offer. What offer? My voice barely came out. To donate. I got tested right after Pia's diagnosis. She pulled up an old medical document. I was a match, not just compatible, a perfect match. My legs gave out. You offered to donate my daughter a kidney? I whispered, voice shaking. She nodded. Your parents said you weren't comfortable accepting an organ from me. Her voice broke completely. They said you cried when they suggested it. The dining room went absolutely still. Even the grandfather clock seemed to stop ticking. We can explain, Dad mumbled, shrinking into his chair like a child. Explain what? I was on my feet now, my chair crashing backward into the china cabinet. That you lied about my daughter's health? That you let her suffer while a perfect kidney was available? Mom's makeup ran in black rivers. We just didn't think it was the right time. You didn't think it was the right time for what? For my daughter's life to be saved? Dad rolled the peas around on his plate, staring at the ceramic like it was enough to make him invisible. After what Dilly did with David, we thought it was best to keep our distance. This is about her affair? The words ripped from my throat. From 10 years ago? You let my baby suffer over your pathetic grudge? My dad looked at me with pleading eyes. We were just trying to do what's best for you, honey. For Pia. My mind raced through every agonizing detail. Birthday parties in hospital rooms instead of parks. No swimming lessons, no sleepovers, just the endless cycle of treatment. 3 years of dialysis, 4 hours at a time, 3 times a week. I'd sold my wedding ring to a pawn shop just to survive, borrowed money from people I shouldn't have, worked 3 jobs until I collapsed from exhaustion, all while my aunt was right there, practically begging to donate. She asked me if she was going to die. Tears were streaming down my face. Do you understand that? My 8-year-old daughter looked me in the eyes and asked if she was going to die. Dilly had collapsed into her chair, sobbing so hard her whole body convulsed. I could have saved her. I wanted to save her. I pulled up photos on my phone. Pia hooked to machines, the blood she'd vomited last week, her growth chart showing how far behind she'd fallen, $200,000 in medical debt, while you told the world she was cured. I grabbed Pia's latest medical report from my purse, hands trembling as I read. Her heart is damaged from the strain. The nephrologist says she might not even survive surgery now because her body's so weak. You didn't just hide help. I looked them dead in the eyes. You might have killed her. Mom's body convulsed with sobs. Even she understood the monstrosity of what they'd done. Dilly stood suddenly, pulling out her phone with newfound determination. We're getting retested tomorrow. I'm calling the transplant coordinator right now. She was already dialing. We're moving Pia up the surgical schedule immediately. Dad reached out desperately. You can't just cut us out. Watch me. The words came out like ice. You had 3 years to tell the truth. 3 years of chances while she suffered. At the door, I turned back one last time. My parents sat frozen at their ruined Christmas dinner, the weight of their crime finally crushing them. You better hope she's strong enough to survive what you did to her. Fast forward 2 months later, when Pia was finally having the surgery. The surgeon came to me in the waiting room. Her heart was too weak from all those years of dialysis. It couldn't handle the surgery. I already stopped listening, because there was just one thing on my mind, making my parents pay. I pushed myself up from the plastic hospital chair and my legs felt like they weren't even mine anymore. The surgeon was still talking, but his words just bounced off me like rain on glass. My feet carried me past him and down the long hallway while nurses moved out of my way. The automatic doors opened and cold February air hit my face, but I didn't feel it. My car was somewhere in the parking garage and I walked 3 floors before remembering where I'd parked it. The steering wheel was freezing under my hands as I sat there for 20 minutes just staring at nothing. The next morning, I drove straight to Brennan's funeral home on Oak Street because they were the only place that didn't require appointments. The director was this older guy with thin gray hair who kept talking about casket materials and lining options while I signed papers. I picked the second cheapest one because the cheapest looked like cardboard, and even now I couldn't do that to her. He asked about flowers and music, and I just kept nodding and signing whatever he put in front of me. My hands were steady even though nothing else was. Dilly showed up while I was still picking out the burial clothes and she was crying, so hard she could barely walk. She kept grabbing my shoulders and saying she should have done more, should have gone straight to me instead of trusting my parents. I told her this wasn't on her, but she wouldn't stop apologizing. We sat in those awful velvet chairs while she sobbed, and I just held her hand because what else was there to do? My phone kept buzzing with calls from my parents, and I had 47 missed calls by noon. Each voicemail notification got deleted without listening because they didn't get to make this about them. They didn't get to explain or cry or beg for forgiveness. The hospital billing department called while I was at the flower shop picking out arrangements for the service. The woman on the phone was talking about surgery costs and payment plans, and I just told her to add it to the pile and hung up. $200,000 was already impossible, so what was another $50,000 on top? That night, I went home and spread everything across my kitchen table. Every email my parents had sent to family members saying Pia was cured. Every text message where they lied about her recovery. Every Facebook post showing old photos and claiming they were recent. I printed everything and organized it into folders by date. The table disappeared under stacks of paper, and I kept going until 3 in the morning. My laptop screen burned my eyes as I screenshot every single lie they'd told. The funeral happened 3 days later at 10 in the morning. Half the family didn't show up because they were supporting my parents through this difficult time, as if they were the victims. The ones who did come kept whispering about what a tragedy it was, but I could hear the judgment underneath their sympathy. My cousin asked how I was holding up financially, and I knew she was really asking if I could have afforded better care. The whole service took 45 minutes, and I don't remember any of it except counting the empty chairs. Winifred Jenkins called me the day after the funeral and said Dilly had given her my number. She was a lawyer who specialized in family law and medical cases and wanted to meet. We sat in her downtown office while she listened to the whole story without interrupting once. She took notes on a yellow legal pad and only looked up when I showed her the emails. When I finished talking, she set down her pen and explained that proving wrongful death would be complicated because of causation issues. The delay in treatment definitely hurt Pia, but proving it directly caused her death was harder. She said we had better options with emotional distress claims and fraud charges. There was also something called interference with medical care that might apply. She needed to research case law, but thought we had multiple angles to pursue. I pulled out the 3 folders I'd made and handed them over. 3 years of medical records showing Pia's decline. Every email and text where my parents lied about her condition. Bank statements showing my financial destruction while they told everyone she was fine. Photos from her hospital stays that proved she was sick when they claimed she was at dance class. Winifred's eyes got wider as she flipped through each page. She said she needed time to review everything and build a strategy, but this was more documentation than most clients ever provided. She'd call me in a few days with a plan. The next morning, my phone rang while I was staring at the coffee maker, and the caller ID showed the hospital's main number. Xanthi Ward from the Social Services Department introduced herself quickly and said she was calling about an internal review they were conducting. She explained that during a routine audit, they'd found a note in Pia's file about us refusing a kidney donation from a family member. The note was dated 3 years ago and signed by someone in administration, but she couldn't share more details because of the ongoing review. She said they take documentation errors very seriously, especially when it involves organ donation, and asked if I had any records about this supposed refusal. I wonder what's really going through the narrator's mind right now with all these people suddenly appearing to help after everything fell apart. The hospital calling about an internal review and finding mysterious notes seems awfully convenient timing. I told her I'd never refused anything, and that I just learned about the donor myself, and she went quiet for a long moment before saying someone would be in touch soon. 3 days later, I was washing dishes when I heard pounding on my apartment door, and through the peephole, I could see my parents standing in the hallway. My dad was holding flowers, and my mom had what looked like a casserole dish, and they kept knocking harder when I didn't answer. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 while they shouted through the door about wanting to explain and make things right. The dispatcher stayed on the line while 2 officers arrived within 10 minutes, and I watched through the peephole as they escorted my parents away from my door. The officers took my statement about the situation with Pia and the lies my parents had told, and one of them gave me paperwork for filing a restraining order. I went to the courthouse the next morning and filled out every form they gave me, explaining how my parents had hidden a kidney donor from my dying daughter. Meanwhile, Dilly had started seeing a therapist twice a week to deal with her guilt about everything. She'd text me after each session with updates about what they'd discussed, always coming back to how she could have saved Pia if she'd known the truth. Her messages would arrive at random times, sometimes at 2 a.m. when she couldn't sleep, filled with apologies and what-ifs that made my chest tight. The therapist had her writing letters to Pia that she'd never send, trying to process the grief and anger she felt toward my parents. 2 weeks after we buried Pia in the small cemetery off Oak Street, I met with Ria Cruz at her office near the hospital. She was the grief counselor the hospital had recommended, and she had a calm way of talking that didn't feel fake or rehearsed. She let me rage for the first 20 minutes about my parents and what they'd done, then helped me understand that wanting revenge was completely normal. She warned that revenge wouldn't bring Pia back though, and that I needed to focus on surviving each day first. We scheduled weekly sessions, and she gave me her cell number for emergencies, which I programmed into my phone but hoped I'd never need. That same afternoon, Winifred called with news about the case she was building. She was sending preservation letters to my parents' email providers and phone companies to make sure they couldn't delete any evidence. She explained that these letters legally required the companies to save all data related to my parents' accounts, including deleted messages and call logs. She'd also subpoenaed their financial records to see if they'd made any payments to the hospital staff or anyone else involved in hiding the truth. The restraining order hearing happened 2 weeks later at the county courthouse, and my parents showed up with their own lawyer in an expensive suit. They sat on the opposite side of the courtroom while I explained to the judge about the lies they'd told to keep Pia from getting a kidney. I showed the judge printouts of the emails Dilly had shared, the ones where my parents described Pia's fake recovery and perfect health. Their lawyer tried to argue that this was a family matter that didn't require court intervention, but the judge cut him off. She granted a temporary restraining order after hearing how they'd interfered with Pia's medical care, ordering them to stay 500 feet away from me and not contact me through third parties. The bills started arriving the week after that, each envelope making my hands shake as I opened it. The funeral home wanted $8,000 for the service and casket, the cemetery needed $3, $500 for the plot and burial, and the hospital's final bill was $210,000 and change. The total was now over $230,000, and I actually laughed when I added it all up because the number didn't even feel real anymore. I stuck them all in a shoebox on top of the refrigerator with the rest of the medical bills I couldn't pay. Then Winifred forwarded me an email from Rosanna Brooks, a reporter from the local paper who wanted to write about medical consent issues and family interference in organ donation. Rosanna had reached out through Winifred because she was working on a series about gaps in the healthcare system that let families override patient needs. She wanted to interview me about the documentation problems and how the hospital had accepted my parents' word without verifying anything with me. I agreed to talk to her, but made it clear I'd only discuss the systemic problems, not the family drama. When we met at a coffee shop downtown, she respected that boundary completely and focused focused her questions on the hospital procedures and documentation requirements. She asked about consent forms, verification processes, and how a note about refusing donation had ended up in Pia's file without my signature. She was particularly interested in how the hospital had never called me directly to confirm such an important decision. 3 days after that article ran, my parents released a statement through their lawyer that made my blood boil. They claimed they had acted out of love and never meant harm, and that this was all a misunderstanding that had gotten out of control. The local news picked it up immediately, and suddenly everyone in town had an opinion about what had happened. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing with calls from reporters, distant relatives, and people I hadn't talked to in years who suddenly wanted to share their thoughts. The grocery store became a minefield of stares and whispers, and I started shopping at 2 a.m. just to avoid running into anyone who might want to discuss it. Winifred called me 3 days later and said she'd filed the lawsuit against my parents for intentional infliction of emotional distress, fraud, and something called tortious interference with medical treatment. She was asking for everything we could get, including funeral costs, all the medical debt, and punitive damages that could run into the millions. I signed every paper she put in front of me without really reading them because at that point, I just wanted my parents to hurt as much as I was hurting. The same week, Xanthi from the hospital called to schedule a meeting about their internal review, and I could tell from her voice that something was off. She met me in a conference room with 2 other administrators and a stack of papers that turned out to be a settlement offer for $15,000. They wouldn't say exactly what they'd found, but Xanthi kept using the phrase documentation irregularities and looking at me with this expression like she wanted to say more but couldn't. The settlement came with an NDA that basically meant I couldn't talk about whatever they'd discovered, but $15,000 was more money than I'd seen in months, so I signed it right there. Winifred said later it wouldn't affect our case against my parents since they were separate legal issues, and the hospital's quick settlement actually helped prove something bad had happened. Discovery started in our civil case 2 weeks later, and Winifred immediately subpoenaed 3 years' worth of my parents' emails, texts, phone records, and financial documents. Their lawyer fought it hard, filing motion after motion to block the subpoenas, but the judge wasn't having any of it and ordered them to turn over everything within 30 days. Meanwhile, my job was falling apart because I couldn't focus on anything, and during a big client meeting, I just started crying and couldn't stop. My boss sent me home, and the next day, HR called to offer me unpaid leave, which was their nice way of saying, don't come back until you get your shit together. Without any income coming in and the medical bills still piling up from before, I started calling bankruptcy attorneys because there was no other way out of the hole I was in. Dilly came over one afternoon to help me sort through paperwork, and while she was going through her old phone looking for anything that might help our case, she suddenly went completely white. She'd found a voicemail from my mother that she'd never deleted, dated just 2 weeks after Pia's diagnosis, saying, "We won't be needing your kidney after all," in this cheerful voice like she was canceling a dinner reservation. We played it for Winifred the next day, and she literally jumped out of her chair because this was exactly the kind of evidence we needed to prove my parents knew about the kidney offer from the very beginning. She filed an amended complaint that same afternoon, adding new charges and damages, and within 48 hours, my parents' lawyer was calling to request mediation, which Winifred said meant they wanted to settle before this got any worse for them. I had to sell everything I owned just to keep the lights on and pay for groceries, starting with my grandmother's jewelry that I'd been saving for Pia, then my laptop, my TV, the nice couch I'd bought when things were better, even the dining room table where we used to eat breakfast together. The apartment got emptier every week until I was basically living with a mattress on the floor and eating off paper plates, and somehow the empty rooms matched exactly how I felt inside. Ria kept scheduling sessions even though I told her I couldn't pay, and we spent most of the time working through what she called survivor's guilt, which was apparently why I kept replaying every moment wondering what I could have done differently. I kept thinking about all the times I'd asked about the transplant list and accepted their vague answers, all the times I should have pushed harder or asked more questions or just called Dilly myself instead of letting my parents control everything. The extended family started picking sides once the lawsuit became public knowledge, and suddenly cousins I'd grown up with were calling me vindictive and selfish for attacking my parents during their time of grief. My mother's sister sent me a long email about how family should stick together and handle things privately, while my father's brother posted on Facebook about how some people just want money from tragedy. How did the parents know exactly when to tell Dilly they wouldn't need her kidney if they were supposedly just finding out about the match? Only Dilly and 2 cousins on my dad's side actually supported me. Everyone else either went silent or actively turned against me. The mediation was scheduled for the following month, but my parents' lawyer kept trying to push it back, filing for extensions and claiming they needed more time to prepare, even though Winifred said they were just stalling. Winifred called me into her office 3 weeks before the scheduled date and spread out a stack of papers across her desk. She pointed to different numbers on the pages and explained how these things usually went. Most families settled for way less than what they deserved because the emotional cost of fighting was too high. She showed me cases where parents got away with paying almost nothing after causing real harm to their kids. Her finger moved down a list of settlement amounts from other cases, and none of them came close to covering what those families had lost. She warned me that my parents would probably offer something insulting like $10,000 and act like they were being generous. I left her office feeling sick but determined not to give in. Every Sunday morning, I drove to the cemetery and sat by Pia's headstone for hours. The grass was still new and hadn't grown in thick yet. I brought fresh flowers each time and threw away the dead ones from the week before. I told her about the case and how her grandparents were still trying to avoid taking responsibility. The cemetery was quiet except for birds and the wind through the trees. It was the only place where the rage inside me settled down enough that I could think straight. Other people visited graves nearby, and we nodded at each other but never talked. I sat there until my legs went numb and then drove home to an empty apartment. 2 weeks later, a thick envelope arrived from my parents' lawyer. Inside were pages and pages of questions I had to answer under oath. They wanted every detail about Pia's medical medical care for the past 3 years. They asked for receipts and bills and treatment records. They wanted to know about my income and expenses and whether I'd tried to get help from other family members. The questions felt like attacks dressed up in legal language. They even asked if I'd been drinking or using drugs during Pia's illness. They wanted to know if I'd followed all the doctor's orders perfectly. Each question felt designed to make me look like a bad mother. I spent 3 days working on the answers with Winifred's help. We had to dig through boxes of medical records and bank statements. Every receipt brought back memories of that specific day in the hospital. I found the parking stub from the day Pia's kidneys first failed. I found the receipt for the stuffed animal I bought her after her first dialysis session. By the time we finished gathering everything they wanted, I couldn't get out of bed for 3 days. The memories came flooding back so hard I couldn't breathe. Ria called me when I missed our regular appointment and stayed on the phone for 2 hours. She helped me work through the panic attacks and reminded me this was part of the process. She said my parents were trying to break me down so I'd give up. A week later, Rosanna's article appeared in the local paper. She didn't use our names, but wrote about a case where grandparents had hidden a kidney match from their grandchild. She interviewed doctors about how verification systems in hospitals could fail. She talked to ethicists about family members interfering with medical decisions. Anyone who knew us would recognize the story immediately. The article spread online and got picked up by bigger news sites. My phone started ringing with calls from reporters wanting more details. I didn't answer any of them. The article led to 3 families reaching out to me through social media. One woman's sister had blocked her from getting a bone marrow transplant for her son. Another family's in-laws had hidden medical information that could have saved their daughter. A man wrote about his parents lying to doctors about his wife's medical history. We started meeting once a month at a coffee shop downtown. We shared our stories and cried together and tried to figure out how people who were supposed to love us could do such terrible things. The group grew to 8 families within 2 months. Winifred scheduled depositions for my parents the following month. She sent me the transcripts afterward, even though she warned me not to read them right away. I couldn't help myself and opened the files on my laptop. My father's deposition was 40 pages long. On page 23, he admitted he thought Dilly didn't deserve to help our family after what she'd done. He said she'd broken trust and shouldn't get to play hero. He actually used the word hero like saving Pia's life would have been some kind of performance. I ran to the bathroom and threw up. My mother's deposition was even worse. She kept saying she was protecting the family from Dilly's toxic influence. She said letting Dilly donate would have given her a permanent connection to us that we couldn't escape. She actually believed she was being righteous by keeping Dilly away. She said Pia would have been confused by having Dilly back in our lives. She said it would have been harmful to Pia's emotional development. She never once mentioned Pia's physical suffering or the fact that she died. The bankruptcy lawyer I met with explained that medical debt could be wiped out, but funeral expenses couldn't. I owed $12,000 to the funeral home that I'd never be able to pay. I filed Chapter 7 bankruptcy and felt like a complete failure. On top of losing Pia, I was now officially broke and ruined. The bankruptcy would follow me for years. Finally, mediation day arrived, and I walked into a conference room at the courthouse. My parents were already sitting on the other side of a long table with their lawyer. They looked older and smaller than I remembered. Their clothes hung loose like they'd lost weight. I felt nothing but cold focus looking at them. Winifred sat down next to me and pulled out a thick folder while their lawyer started talking about how my parents wanted to put this behind them and move forward as a family. The insurance company representative cleared his throat and slid a paper across the table with $50,000 written on it. Winifred actually laughed out loud and pushed it back without even looking at me. She wrote $500,000 on her legal pad and held it up for everyone to see. Their lawyer's face went red and he started yelling about extortion while my parents just stared at the table. The insurance guy kept tapping his pen and making notes while Winifred pulled out medical bills and started reading the amounts one by one. $23,000 for the first surgery attempt, $14,000 for the cardiac unit stay, $8,000 for the ambulance that took her when her heart stopped at home. My mom started crying harder with each number. We took a break after 2 hours and I went to the bathroom to splash water on my face. My mother followed me into the hallway and reached out like she wanted to touch my arm, but I walked right past her like she wasn't even there. She started sobbing behind me, but I just kept walking to the vending machine and bought a bottle of water. Back in the room, the numbers kept going back and forth while the lawyers argued about liability and damages and emotional distress. My dad kept trying to catch my eye, but I focused on a water stain on the wall behind his head. 4 hours in, they offered $75,000. Winifred countered with $300. The insurance guy made phone calls and came back with $90. We sat there for 6 more hours with breaks every hour where I'd go stand in the parking lot and breathe the cold air while my parents huddled with their lawyer. Finally, at hour 6, they offered $125,000 plus a mutual no-contact agreement that meant we could never speak to or about each other publicly. Winifred pulled me aside and said trials are expensive and juries are unpredictable, and this was guaranteed money now instead of maybe more money in 2 years. I signed the papers. The worst part was the settlement included no admission of wrongdoing, which felt like swallowing broken glass. Winifred reminded me that money wouldn't bring justice anyway, just some financial relief for all the debt. The check came 3 weeks later, and I used $30,000 to pay off the funeral home and put aside $20,000 for therapy because I was going twice a week now. The rest went into a special account at the bank where I set up the Pia Memorial Fund to help families afford the costs of getting tested for organ donation. Dilly wrote the first check for $5,000 and promised she'd organize fundraisers through her company. 3 months after the settlement, I still woke up screaming from nightmares about the surgery day when the monitors started beeping and they pushed me out of the room. Ria kept telling me that trauma doesn't follow timelines and healing isn't linear, but I felt stuck in that moment when the surgeon said her heart couldn't take it. My cousin texted me that my parents had sold their house and moved to Arizona, which was good because I didn't want to run into them at the grocery store or anywhere else. Dilly and I met for coffee once a month to go over the fund applications, and we had this weird relationship where we couldn't really be close, but we both needed to keep Pia's memory doing something something good. The support group I'd been going to grew from 5 families to 12, and we started meeting with lawyers about pushing for new laws requiring hospitals to verify consent for medical decisions. A state representative agreed to meet with us next month after one of the moms in our group told her story to the local news and it went viral. 2 weeks after that meeting, I walked back into my office for the first time since everything happened. My boss had agreed to let me work 20 hours a week, mostly doing data entry stuff that didn't require much talking to people. Something doesn't add up about these parents crying and looking smaller while still refusing to admit they did anything wrong. That's a strange mix of guilt and denial happening there. The receptionist gave me this weird half smile when I walked in, like she didn't know if she should say welcome back or sorry for your loss. Most of my coworkers just looked at their computers when I passed their desks. During lunch that first day, I sat alone in the break room and nobody came in the whole time I was there, which told me they were all eating at their desks to avoid the awkward conversation. That was actually fine with me because I needed the job for money and routine, not for making friends or chatting about weekend plans. The next morning I got a call from the bank where we'd set up the fund account, and they said we had our first application ready for review. A family in Ohio needed help getting to their evaluation appointments at Cleveland Clinic, and the dad had already missed 2 days of work just for the initial screening. We sent them $500 that afternoon for gas, a cheap motel, and food during their 3-day evaluation process. It wasn't much, but the mom sent us this long email about how they'd been sleeping in their car before, and now their kid could have a real bed the night before his tests. I printed that email and kept it in my desk drawer at work. About a month later, Xanthi called me at home one evening and said she couldn't officially recommend our fund because of hospital policy, but she'd been leaving our flyers in the family waiting room and mentioning it during casual conversations with families who seemed to be struggling financially. She said 3 families had already reached out to us after talking to her, and she wanted to make sure we could handle the volume. I told her we had enough for maybe 15 families if we kept the amount small, and she said she'd be selective about who she mentioned it to. The months started blending together in this weird fog where I did everything I was supposed to do, but felt like I was watching someone else live my life. I went to work, processed claims, came home, reviewed fund applications, paid my bills, bought groceries, went to support group meetings, visited Pia's grave every Sunday, and somehow 6 months had passed since the funeral. People kept telling me I was doing so well, but they didn't see me sitting on her bedroom floor at 2 in the morning, holding her favorite stuffed elephant and trying to remember exactly how her laugh sounded. The state representative called in late fall to tell me the legislation had died in committee because several medical associations had opposed it, saying it would create too much bureaucracy and interfere with doctor-patient relationships. She said we could try again next session with more families testifying and better organization, maybe get some media coverage to put pressure on the committee members. I wrote down everything she said, but honestly didn't have the energy to feel disappointed about it. One afternoon, I was buying groceries when I ran into Mrs. Patterson, who'd been friends with my mom for like 30 years. She grabbed my arm in the cereal aisle and started telling me how destroyed my parents were, how my dad had aged 10 years, how my mom barely left the house anymore. I pulled my arm away and told her they destroyed themselves the day they chose their pride over their granddaughter's life, then left my half-full cart right there and walked out of the store. By spring, the fund had helped 10 families, and we got this thank you card with a photo of a little boy holding a sign that said 60 days post-transplant with a huge smile on his face. His mom wrote that our help with travel costs meant his dad didn't lose his job and they didn't lose their house during the recovery period. I sat in my car in the work parking lot and cried for an hour, but it was different from the grief crying because there was something else mixed in, like maybe Pia's death could mean something for other kids. Dilly called that night to tell me she'd started volunteering at the hospital as a living donor advocate, helping families understand the testing process and navigate the conversations with relatives who might be matches. She said she'd already helped 2 families identify potential donors they hadn't even considered asking, and one of them turned out to be a perfect match. The calendar on my phone started sending me reminders that the 1-year mark was coming up, and I felt this heavy dread building in my chest every morning when I woke up. Rhea from the support group had lost her son 3 years earlier, and she came over one evening with a notebook and helped me plan out the day hour by hour. We'd go to the cemetery first thing in the morning before other people would be there, then spend the afternoon with the support group doing this memorial service they'd planned for all our kids. She said the first anniversary was the hardest because everyone expected you to be better by now, but you weren't, and having a plan helped you get through without falling apart completely. When the day came, I followed the schedule exactly like we'd planned. I brought fresh flowers to her grave and sat there for an hour telling her about the fund and all the kids it had helped. The support group had rented a room at the community center, and 12 families showed up, each with a photo of their child and a candle to light. We went around the circle, and everyone said their child's name and age, and one thing they loved most about them. When it was my turn, I said Pia, 8 years old, and that she used to make up songs about everything, even boring stuff like brushing teeth or putting on socks. The woman next to me squeezed my hand, and we all sat there in this circle of grief that somehow made it bearable to keep breathing. 3 weeks later, a thick envelope arrived from my parents' lawyer. Inside was a formal request asking permission to place flowers on Pia's grave for her birthday next month. My hands shook as I read their carefully worded plea about how they just wanted to honor their granddaughter's memory. I called Winifred immediately and had her draft a response that they'd forfeited that right when they chose their pride over her life. The letter went out that same day, and I blocked their lawyer's number from my phone. Meanwhile, the Pia Memorial Fund kept growing faster than I'd ever imagined. Donations poured in from strangers who'd followed the story online, and within 2 months we had enough to hire a part-time coordinator. Her name was Rosanna, and she'd lost her own son to kidney disease 5 years ago. She understood exactly why this mattered, and threw herself into the work with the kind of dedication that only comes from personal loss. We started helping 2 families a month with everything from gas money for dialysis trips, to covering insurance copays, to just being there when they needed needed someone who understood. Each family got a care package with gift cards, information packets, and a handwritten note letting them know they weren't alone. The rage I carried didn't disappear, but it changed into something else. It settled deep in my bones, cold and permanent like the grief itself. I stopped waiting for it to go away because I understood now that some things become part of you forever. The anger was there when I woke up and when I went to sleep, and I'd made peace with carrying it for the rest of my life. Every Sunday, I went to the cemetery and sat by Pia's headstone for an hour. I'd bring fresh daisies because those were her favorite, and I'd tell her about the families we were helping. About the little boy in Toledo whose transplant surgery got scheduled thanks to our advocacy work. About the teenage girl whose family could finally afford the special diet she needed because we covered their grocery bills. About the grandmother who cried when we paid for her grandson's medications for 3 months. I knew Pia would be proud that something good came from all this pain. The truth hit me one morning as I was reviewing fund applications at my kitchen table. Revenge hadn't fixed anything, and the justice we got was only partial at best. My parents lost their freedom, but Pia was still gone. The criminal case gave us some accountability, but it couldn't bring her back. What I had now was survival, and the choice to use that survival to help other families avoid our tragedy. It had to be enough because it was all I had left. The fund kept growing, and more volunteers joined, and we expanded to 3 neighboring states. Each success story was a tiny light in the darkness, proof that Pia's death meant something beyond just loss and rage and broken hearts. Thanks for exploring all these questions with me today. I really loved wondering about things together. Hope to share more curiosity with you soon. And if you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.